Hey everyone, this is our Sunday Bible study for February 21st, 2021. I hope that you've been staying warm and safe this week. We've had some unusual weather, a lot of snow and really cold for this area. I've heard someone joke just recently saying they thought that someone had picked up West Tennessee and moved it up north because this is definitely not what we're used to, but all that should be thawing out some now. And we'll continue over the next several days, and maybe things will resume back to normal. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to stop in here so that we can spend some time studying God's Word together. We're continuing our study in the Foundations material from the Gospel Advocate. We are looking this quarter at the book of Genesis. In fact, we are in the last chapter of the book of Genesis today. We're in lesson 12 in the book, looking at mourning for Jacob, taken from Genesis chapter 50, verses 1 through 14. We have just this lesson and then next lesson in this quarter, and that'll wrap up this quarter. The books for next quarter, they're not out this Sunday, but next Sunday they'll be laying in the pews in front of you and behind you, unless, of course, you sit on the very back pew, and then obviously there's no books behind you. But we'll have those setting out so that you can pick those up. That way you'll be ready for when we do start the next quarter. But we still got 2 lessons left. We got this one and then next week, and that will round out the book of Genesis for us. And so we're in Genesis chapter 50 this morning. If you have your Bibles handy, looking at Jacob, the mourning for Jacob. The book begins in the introduction by saying Jacob lived 17 years after he moved from Canaan to Egypt. Before his death, he made Joseph promise to bury him with his fathers. Of course, we noticed that in the last lesson that we looked at, the family vow that was made, placing his hand under Jacob's thigh and making that promise to bury him in the cave of Machpelah. He also summoned the strength to provide blessings and directions to his sons. In one particularly moving statement, he declared to Joseph, "I have not thought to see your face, but in fact, God has also shown me your offspring." Jacob was thankful for the time that he had with Joseph, whom he thought long dead, and the time that he had with his sons. Jacob recognized that, all of this that had taken place, that it was God who was at work here. He was thankful to God for the longevity of his life, for reuniting him with Joseph, for the opportunity to see even Joseph's sons. This was a son who he thought was dead, and not only now has he seen that son, but he's seen his grandsons through him. Consequently, he understood he would not live forever. Consequently, he sought to speak to his family members before it was too late. That was a line in the book here that really struck me and made me think about, us and do we talk to those people that we love? Do we show them that we love them? Do we express that love to them? Because truth is, we don't know how long we have with them. Life is short and can be cut even shorter at any point in time. And so I thought it was interesting the author of the book made that statement that he sought to speak to his sons before it was too late. As a means of honoring Joseph, Jacob claimed Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, as his own. We see that taking place even more so when Ephraim and Manasseh become tribes in Israel. Regarding them, he said, "As now your 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. Your offspring whom you beget after them shall be yours. They will be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance." And so this was a great honor that Jacob is bestowing upon the 2 sons of Joseph, for them to be considered his own. He then said to Joseph, "Behold, I am dying, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers." After blessing Joseph and his sons, Jacob summoned all his sons before his death and said, "Gather together that I may tell you what shall befall you in the last days. Gather together and hear, your sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel your father." Genesis 49, 1 and 2. He then proceeded to bless each one according to his own blessing. Following these final remarks, Jacob reiterated his desire to be buried in Canaan. He then drew his feet up into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Verse 33, Jacob's pilgrimage on earth was over. You know, that final statement there is something that's the final statement in the verse 33 of Genesis 49. And he was gathered to his people. At this point, Jacob's not in the cave of Machpelah. And so that phrase, he was gathered with his people, can't be referring to the fact that he was buried with family members in that cave. It's referring to the fact that his soul went and was reunited with those who had gone before him. And so there's a lot of comfort in that statement for us. And to know that there's more to this life. There's more coming. It's why the author said Jacob's pilgrimage on this earth was over. Not everything was over, but just his time walking about on this earth had come to a close. That brings us to our lesson text. Once again, we're in Genesis chapter 50, noticing together the first 14 verses. The author entitles the first section, Official Mourning, in verses 1 through 3. After Sarah's death, Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. His reaction to the passing of his wife was appropriate. It is natural to mourn the loss of a loved one. On that occasion, Abraham also made provisions for Sarah's burial. This too is part of the grieving process. Thus, we are not surprised by Joseph's reaction to the death of his father, Jacob. In verse 1, the Bible reads, "Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him." The author says this reaction was not surprising, especially when viewed in light of the way Jacob and Joseph loved one another. When Jacob believed Joseph was killed, he wept for him. When Jacob came to Egypt, Joseph fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. Both father and son shed tears over one another in life. Now Joseph wept over his father's death. Kissling wrote the favorite son of the father had just lost that father, and the normal signs of grief came flooding out. While weeping is a modern sign of grief that we share with the ancient audience, falling on the face of a corpse and kissing it may seem strange to some modern observers, but people in grief often touch and kiss the corpse at such times. You know, we look at all this, and it just made me think about this. And I don't know where this saying came from or why it began, but it's definitely a saying that I wish would just go away and never be spoken. And that is the statement, "Real men don't cry." I don't know where that statement came from, but I would submit to you that Joseph was a real man. He had gone through a lot in life and had showed himself to be a man who rose above those circumstances. Of course, God, the one behind him, moving things so that would happen. But Joseph was someone who was real. He was someone who was a man, and yet here we see him weeping for his father. That weeping should not surprise us. It is the fact that when we look at this, that real men do cry. Both father and son wept over each other. John 11:35, Jesus, the realest man that I know, the Bible says that Jesus wept. And so we have this idea of weeping seen by lots of individuals. This is a normal part of the mourning and the grieving process. In verse 2, "And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, so the physicians embalmed Israel." Beginning on page 130, the author says, as Walton noted, numerous rituals were associated with embalming because it reflected a particular view of the afterlife. It was performed by a trained group of mortuary priests who removed the internal organs and then placed the body in embalming fluids for 40 days. The philosophy behind this is the Egyptians' belief that the body must be preserved as a repository for the soul after death. Now, obviously, we know Jacob didn't believe that. We know Joseph didn't believe that. We know his sons didn't believe that. But the individual here, Walton, says the fact that the bodies of Jacob and Joseph are embalmed may suggest the desire of the Israelites to soothe the feelings of the Egyptians. but it also serves the purpose of preserving their bodies for later burial in Canaan. And so just because they underwent this process doesn't mean that they believed what the Egyptians believed. But it was a way to, for one, preserve the body. They're going to be traveling all the way to the land of Canaan. That's not a short journey there. And also it would help to preserve the body for that purpose, and it might help with the Egyptians to soothe them because they're mourning for this loss as well. And so that's one of the things that I thought about here. You know, there's always a question. Usually people have a question about cremation, whether or not that's something that a Christian should do. Well, as we read throughout the Bible, there's lots of different ways in which people were buried. You know, we see here in the Old Testament, and even when we look at the brief burial period of Jesus, and that was done in a cave. Well, we're not buried in caves today. We're buried in the ground. We dig a hole. Does that mean that that's wrong to do that because that's not the example that we see in the Bible? No, that doesn't mean that that's wrong. Different cultures have different practices when it comes to this process. We see here that Jacob was embalmed in a very different way than the embalming process that we done. All of his organs were removed. He was placed in the solutions for 40 days. And, you know, we don't go through that process. Does that mean that Jacob was wrong in doing that because we don't see that happening to many other people? No, that doesn't mean that. Different burial procedures. And cremation would be another one. There's nothing scripturally that violates. And so they're just keeping with the customs of where they're at that don't violate their conscience or that do not. Now, if you feel that would be wrong, well, then don't do it. Don't violate your conscience, but there's nothing scripturally that would violate. Verse 3 says, 40 days were required for him, for such are the days required for those who were embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. Now, the author says that Brueggemann, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but he correctly noted, Jacob dies as an honored man. I love the next sentence. The one who kicked his way out of the womb and conned, he puts that in quotes, his way into God's promise, is at rest in the plot of promise and is honored even by the empire. You think about this for a moment. This is Jacob. This is the same Jacob who convinced, and of course it didn't take much convincing, but who bought the birthright from Esau for a bowl of stew. This is the same Jacob that through the advice of his mother stole the blessing from Esau. This is the same Jacob who throughout his early life struggled with following God and doing things God's way. This is the same Jacob that would have died in the land of Canaan through famine, if not for God's protection and God bringing Joseph to the position that he was in. This is that Jacob. And now he is being honored by the most powerful nation in all the world at this time. How does that happen? Well, it only happens when God is at the helm. It only happens with God in control. That would have never happened any other way. We see in these first 3 verses the power of the God of heaven. That brings us to the second section that the author gives us. He says, Joseph explains his vow in verses 4 through 9. When the embalming of Jacob's body was complete and the initial period of mourning for his death ended, Joseph explained to Pharaoh and his household the vow that he made to his father. Beginning in verse 4, and when the days of mourning were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, Behold, I am dying in my grave, which I am dying, in my grave which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore please let me go up and bury my father, and I will come back. The text gives no reasons on page 132 in our book why Joseph needed Pharaoh's permission to leave Egypt to bury Jacob. Perhaps it was an act of courtesy to inform the king and receive his blessing. Perhaps there were genuine doubts about whether Pharaoh would allow any of Joseph's family to depart from the land. Longman observed Joseph may have been the second most powerful person in Egypt, but even he cannot do anything without the approval of Pharaoh. He had earlier sought Pharaoh's permission to bring Jacob and his family to Egypt. Now he seeks permission for his family to return to Canaan in order to bury his father. Joseph understood where he sat. Yes, Joseph was a powerful man, but he did not allow that power to make him forget that he wasn't the most powerful man in the land of Egypt. He recognized that Pharaoh was still the one in charge, and therefore he went to Pharaoh and sought Pharaoh's blessing in keeping this vow, this promise that Joseph had made to Jacob. In verse 6, and Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father as he made you swear." So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt. So this isn't a small group that's going here. As well as the house of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's house. Only the little ones, their flocks and their herds, they left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great gathering. On page 132, the author writes, Jacob's funeral was more than a family affair. It was, as Steinman wrote, an official Egyptian state procession, as the presence of horses and chariots attests. The procession left from the land of Goshen, the same place from which the Israelites would leave Egypt 4 centuries later. Joseph kept his promise to Jacob. He took his body back to Canaan for burial. Once again, here we have Jacob, who is now being buried. He's having basically a state funeral by the land of Egypt. Once again, that doesn't happen without God being the one that is in control. That brings us to the third section in the book as the author lays it out. He says, Jacob buried in Machpelah, verses 10 through 14. The author says we first read about the cave of the field in Machpelah in Genesis 23, when Abraham buried Sarah in that location. That, however, was just the beginning of the location's significance in the biblical record. In addition to Sarah, Abraham was buried there. It was also the burial place of Isaac and Rebekah, as well as Jacob's wife, Leah. Jacob made Joseph promise to bury him there with his fathers. He also charged his other sons with the same task. Thus, the procession of individuals transporting the body of Jacob from Egypt to Canaan made their way toward that location. And so they're headed to this area that's a very significant area for the children of Israel. In verse 10, then they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, and they mourned there with a great and very solemn lamentation. He observed 7 days of mourning for his father. According to Hamilton, the book says 7 days was the normal period for mourning. And he lists several passages there, 1 Samuel 31:13, 2 Samuel 11:27, Job 2:13. The 30 days of mourning for Moses and for Aaron are exceptional. Other texts refer to fasting as part of the mourning ceremony. Perhaps mourning included a number of acts, of which fasting would only be one, and hence the reason of not mentioning it explicitly in verse 10. Regardless, their mourning impacted the Canaanites, who concluded this is the deep mourning of the Egyptians. Nevertheless, Gangle and Brammer explained the people of Canaan misinterpreted the event. The clothing, the coffin, and maybe even the language may have led to this assumption. But the reality was that this was a Hebrew patriarch who was buried in the land he believed he owned by faith. Jacob's resolve to be buried in Canaan rather than Egypt greatly impacted Joseph, who later made a similar request concerning his bones. And so Jacob is being buried exactly where he wants to be because he believes this is the land of his inheritance. In verse 12 through verse 14, so his sons did for him just as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan, and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite as a property for a burial place. And after he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt. He and his brothers and all who were with him went up with him to bury his father. Ross wrote, the family of Jacob with its attendant company of Gentiles rehearsed, as it were, the future homecoming of the nation in fulfillment of the promises to Israel. Once more the children of Israel would leave Egypt, taking with them the bones of the patriarch. In that instance, it would be Joseph. Here, however, the pilgrimage to the land of promise was only temporary. The grave was only a claim to the land. Moses would lead the next pilgrimage to Canaan. Even so, Jacob was laid to rest with Abraham and Isaac, and God's people were reminded that Egypt was not their home. The author gives us two applications to look at as we close out our lesson. First, he says it is fitting to mourn the loss of a loved one. It is also appropriate to make sure the dead are buried with dignity. Although the burial process is not identical in every culture, the need to grieve is constant. Let us show compassion toward those who mourn. When possible, weep with those who weep, Romans 12:15. At the same time, realize that Christians do not sorrow as others who have no hope, 1 Thessalonians 4:13. Because Jesus defeated death, we can as well. Death is not the end. I've always loved the statement that at death, God placed a comma, not a period. As you read, if you're reading a paragraph and you come to a comma, if you come to a period, that means to stop. That's the end of that sentence. If you come to a comma, that says to pause and then to continue on. And that's what death is. It's a pause. It's another stop on the journey that we're going through. And so death was not the end of Jacob. Jacob's soul went to paradise, where it will stay until Jesus returns. At that time, Jacob will be, his soul will be reunited with his body will be changed, he'll have a new body. And friends, that's something that we're all waiting for, all hoping for, all looking for. We need to always remember death is not the end of our journey. The second application he gives us, he says, Jacob's burial in Canaan served as a visible reminder that Egypt was not his home. Christians need a similar reminder about this world. At the longest, our time on this earth is brief. We must live in preparation for the eternal home in the heavens awaiting the faithful. Paul told the Corinthians, for we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. We sing that song sometimes, this world is not my home. We need to remember that, and we need to live like that. I want to thank you for taking time today to study with me as we go through this lesson in the book of Genesis. Next week, we'll be in Lesson 13, final lesson for this quarter, entitled Fear and Assurance. And it's taken from Genesis chapter 15 through 26, closing out the book of Genesis. Once again, thanks for being here. Remember, friends, stay healthy, stay hopeful, stay holy, and I hope you have a great day.